Welcome, I'm Sean Sposato, and this is Inside the Magic's Fallen Attractions Flashback, where we take a look back at some of the world's greatest attractions from some of the world's greatest theme parks. On today's episode, we're looking back at a ride that used to be famous for taking its guests on a journey through the history of flight. This included everything from crop dusting, parachuting, and gliding aboard modern jetliners. The Delta Dreamflight attraction used to operate in Tomorrowland at Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World. The experience took its guests on a pop-up book journey through the history of flight using simplistic sets, audio animatronics, and projection effects. Pop-up books, some of my favorite childhood memories. This attraction was very light and airy as its background was more historical. Some of the scenes of the attraction included barnstormers, an M130, Tokyo and Paris in the 1930s, the jet age, and the future of air travel. Delta Dreamflight was not the most exciting attraction in the park. It was more of a scenic and historical type of ride. But, however, because of the fact that it touched on future technology, it fit in perfectly in Magic Kingdom's Tomorrowland. The Delta Dreamflight attraction experience began once guests entered the queue. The queue of the ride was designed to look like an airport boarding terminal. Here is also where guests could see the front end nose and cockpit of an actual Delta 767, which was situated on the left entering the queue. As visitors continued throughout the queue, they would see a terminal gate with posters on the wall that included a bunch of exciting and exotic destinations around the world. This led to the terminal gate where guests would enter the side of the jet into a mirrored hallway with bright blue, green, red, and yellow neon lights. I guess Delta was a funky and groovy type of airline. Virgin America, eat your heart out. Once guests would walk up a ramp, they would enter the boarding area. Here, guests would walk onto a moving escalator ramp and board the flight. After taking off, guests would immediately encounter a giant mural depicting the golden era of aviation in America. Then they would enter the first room. This room had a giant pop-up book-style spinning set with a hot air balloon and other flying contraptions spinning by them as the Dreamflight song played in the background. This set had 3 separate displays, and they could only be seen when each individual set had rotated toward the ride vehicles. So you could potentially never see one side of the sets depending on the timing of the ride. Imagine riding this ride several times and never seeing one of the sets. With the way this was set up, this could actually happen. This led to the second room of the attraction, which was designed to look as if riders were in a giant crop field of the American Midwest in the 1920s. In this room, biplanes, stunt planes, and barnstormers could be seen flying all over the ceiling above a flying circus air show. One of the planes had crashed through a barn and was stuck in the rafters on the ceiling. He was okay though. Or was he? In the third room was a big screen with a film clip of an aerial stuntman standing on top of a prop plane while it performed crazy stunts in the air. This led to the propeller plane era, where commercial flights started taking passengers all over the globe. On the left, you could see guests passing the inside of a fancy and elegant airliner's fuselage, which is the dining area of a first-class trip. Then you could see a gentleman in a suit who stood on the guest's left in a Japanese garden where he was being greeted by Japanese locals. On the right-hand side below the guests were the rooftops and the skyline of Paris, France. As guests moved forward, a giant spinning light along with fog and fans gave the impression that they were about to actually enter the inside of a turbojet engine. The sounds of an engine roaring to life and taking off would then blast out over the sound system. In this room is where visitors saw footage of a plane taking off from a runway to simulate their flight's departure. The plane would eventually lift off and fly through the clouds into the sky. The next room was another film clip, which showed computer-generated scenes of the guests above the Earth. This included flying in a canyon above water and eventually flying in a futuristic city with fireworks exploding all around them. wonder if the creators of Soarin' took a note from this attraction. The final room of the attraction was a giant pop-up book with destinations spread out on huge pages. This was, of course, joined by a Delta jet flying above the display into the clouds above it. Before this flight down memory lane landed in Magic Kingdom, If You Had Wings once stood in its place. Sponsored by Eastern Airlines, the attraction was similar in that it took passengers and vehicles through all the exciting places one could fly if they had wings. This ride's adventures included projection screens placed in part with real-world props to create the illusion of people actually waving from windows in ships. This attraction was at Magic Kingdom from 1972 to 1989. In 1987, the attraction lost its sponsorship from Eastern Airlines and was renamed If You Could Fly for the remainder of its time at Magic Kingdom. This name change did not help with the attraction's popularity, and in 1988, Delta Airlines had its eye on sponsoring the attraction. If You Could Fly closed its doors in 1988, and 5 months later, Delta Dreamflight opened, which of the many attractions that came before and after it had to be the most memorable.
First came the Magic Kingdom, then the incredible Epcot Center. Now comes the new Disney-Mgm Studios theme park.
What was so special for the timing of this attraction's opening was that this attraction opened only 2 months after Disney-Mgm Studios had, and in 1989, many of the Disney theme park attractions were becoming heavily themed from the company's extremely popular films. For the park to have an attraction like this was kind of a big deal because it didn't really tie into any other Disney property, and in essence, it was more of just a historical themed attraction. And for those of you out there who don't really understand the tie-in between an airline and a theme park, you really have to understand the times.
Come take a flight of fantasy.
Welcome aboard Delta. Oh!
Fly Delta to the new Disney-Mgm Studios theme park at Walt Disney World, where you'll see how movies are made and be part of the action. Your road to stardom.
Essentially, this attraction opened during a time of when travel agencies were a big part of vacationing, especially for people from outside of the state of Florida looking to come to Walt Disney World. At this time, the internet really wasn't much of a thing, nor did it exist on a consumer or commercial level as it does now. So these companies are who prospective vacationers would turn to for vacation stays, attractions within the parks, all the different parks offered at Walt Disney World.
Welcome to our world of fun, it's made for you and me. D-I-S-N-E-Y, it's the place to be.
So this attraction at Walt Disney World was a big deal to Delta because they had been the ones who were helping so many people visit the parks themselves. It's amazing that nowadays people can just pull the cell phone out of their pocket and look up everything they need to know about Walt Disney World. Honestly, I don't know how people did it back in the day. Like, really. Now, of course, even though Delta was a big part of the attraction did not by any means just revolve around the airline. When designing the attraction, Imagineers were focused on the history of flight and then, of course, placed the company's logos appropriately within the ride. Delta Dreamflight wasn't just a billboard for Delta. A lot of time and thought and effort had gone into this attraction by Disney Imagineers. Delta Dreamflight was the third attraction to be built in its former location in Tomorrowland, where Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin currently sits today. Delta Dreamflight was more of a rework, and so because of this, it was able to retain the same track from its previous If You Had Wings and the If You Could Fly attractions. Later, when Delta pulled its sponsorship from the attraction, and it was then re-renovated into Take Flight, the attraction continued with the same track. Talk about reduce, reuse, and recycle. You go, Disney. Later, I will touch more on the current status of the attraction as it is now Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger Spin. But a fun fact about this current attraction is that it still occupies the same track that was created back in 1972 from the spot's first If You Had Wings attraction. Of course, now the track has more advanced ride vehicles that are more capable and are able to move in circular movements. Delta Dreamflight was not the most popular attraction in the park. In fact, most of the time, guests would kind of just walk on because usually there was no line for the attraction. A lot of times, people would get off the ride and then get right back on if other attractions around the park had long wait times, just because the line was that short. This attraction did close some time ago, but one thing that everyone seems to remember the most about it is its song. The song featured throughout the ride, which is notoriously remembered as one of the most memorable and maybe even a little too unforgettable theme park ride songs of all time, was composed by Edo Giuditti. Giuditti is a famous composer and had actually composed songs for other attractions in Epcot. One thing that was so interesting about this attraction song was the fact that its song would actually stay the same throughout, only it would change tempo depending upon which room you entered. The tempo and lyrics would be matched in each room to fit in with its theme and location as it regarded to the story of the ride. Another fun fact about this attraction that many people to this day do not know the full story behind is the Spirit of Delta, which was worded in gold on the Delta 767 featured in the ride's old queue. This was a nod to the resilience of the company's employees, particularly after the time of airline deregulation in the United States. During this time, the company had been suffering and had gone through issues with profits, so a few Delta employees had come together and started to find ways of compiling funds through the help of retired and current employees during the company's hard times. Through their teamwork, they were able to raise $30 million. This money was used to purchase a Boeing 767 for Delta to help keep the company going. Now, of course, like every great attraction, this one also had to come to an end. Delta had sponsored the ride from its opening in 1989, but did choose to pull its financial backing of the attraction in 1995. The decision not to continue the sponsorship of Delta Dreamflight was in part due to costs of sponsoring the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, Georgia. The ride was temporarily closed from January 1st to June 4th of 1996 to be reworked as Take Flight. The slight refurbishment essentially only removed all references to Delta, including the ride's theme song. From 1996 to 1998, the attraction had lost the majority of its ridership and continued to become less and less popular, and by January of 1998, Delta Dreamflight's doors were closed for good. Currently in its place is Buzz Lightyear's Space Ranger spin, inspired by Disney Pixar's Toy Story films. Now let's take a look back at this historical and scenic ride as we have the full attraction on film.
About to depart for great historic areas in aviation. The safety bar will lower automatically. Please keep your hands with the inside your flight and your contact
Non-stop fantasy. Oh yeah. From the earliest days we tried it. On the air we've been relying. To lift us high above the deep blue sea. And before this flight is through, you'll be soaring in the sky so blue. Like
takeoff.
Ladies and gentlemen, your Dreamflight will depart immediately for the future. Please prepare for supersonic takeoff.
Ladies and gentlemen, your Dreamflight will depart immediately for the future. Please prepare
There you have it, a look back at one of Disney's fallen attractions. Thank you so much for joining me on this edition of Inside the Magic's Fallen Attractions Flashback. Please be sure to comment below or tweet us at Inside the Magic any ideas for any future episodes. See you guys next time.